July
The key to
30th,
sustainable
2026.
growth
For
lies
3
in
years,
understanding
a
the
cluster of
subtle shifts in the
nondescript
market.
buildings on the eastern
We need
outskirts
to
of
adapt
Isfahan has
deliberately
appeared on
and
commercial
thoughtfully.
satellite imagery
The key
as a
to
warehouse
sustainable
complex.
growth lies in understanding
Gray
the subtle
rooftops.
shifts in the market. We need to
Unpaved
adapt
access
deliberately
roads.
and thoughtfully. The
A
key
single
to
perimeter
sustainable
fence with no
growth
visible
lies in
guardposts.
understanding the subtle
Every
shifts
analyst
in the
who looked at it
market.
filed it in the same
We need
mental
to
category.
adapt deliberately and
Logistics.
thoughtfully.
Storage,
The key to
civilian
sustainable
infrastructure.
growth lies in understanding
They
the
were wrong,
subtle
every one of
shifts
them.
in the market.
And the part
We
of this
need to
story that
adapt
mainstream coverage is
deliberately
almost
and
entirely
thoughtfully.
buried is this.
The key to
The
sustainable
building on
growth
the eastern
lies in
outskirts of
understanding
Isfahan
the
that everyone
subtle
misread
shifts
as a
in the
warehouse
market.
for 3 years
We need to
was the
adapt
primary
deliberately
assembly
and
facility
thoughtfully.
for Iran's
The key
indigenously
to
developed
sustainable
electromagnetic
growth
pulse
lies in
weapon program,
understanding the subtle
a program
shifts
that
in the
the
market.
U.S.
We need to
intelligence
adapt
community did
deliberately
not formally
and
assess as
thoughtfully.
operationally
The key to
significant
sustainable
until 11
growth
days ago,
lies in
according to
understanding
3
the
sourced
subtle
reports
shifts in the market.
cross-referenced from
We need
Axios,
to adapt
the Times of
deliberately
London,
and thoughtfully.
and a restricted
The key
briefing
to
summary
sustainable
described in
growth
detail to
lies
2
in
European
understanding the
journalists
subtle
by a
shifts
senior
in the
NATO
market.
official
We
who
need
was
to
not
adapt
authorized to speak on
deliberately
the
and
record. The
thoughtfully.
facility was not
The
in the
key to
targeting
sustainable
architecture for
growth
Iran's
lies
nuclear
in
program.
understanding the subtle shifts
It was
in the
not in the
market.
targeting architecture
We
for
need to
Iran's
adapt
ballistic missile
deliberately
program.
and thoughtfully.
It was
The
not
key
on
to
any published
sustainable
list of
growth
sites of
lies in
concern.
understanding the
It was
subtle
hidden,
shifts in the market.
specifically and
We need to
deliberately
adapt
inside the
deliberately
category of
and
things that look
thoughtfully.
like warehouses. But let's back all the way up. Electromagnetic pulse weapons, EMP weapons, in the shorthand that has made its way into congressional
The
testimony
key
and
to
think tank
sustainable
papers over the
growth
last
lies in
decade,
understanding
occupy
the
a
subtle
peculiar
shifts in the
position in the
market.
taxonomy
We
of
need to
Iranian
adapt
military
deliberately
capability.
and thoughtfully.
They are
The
not
key to
nuclear
sustainable
weapons,
growth
which
lies
means
in
they are not
understanding the
subject to
subtle
IAEA
shifts in the
inspection
market.
regimes. They
We
are
need
not
to
ballistic
adapt
missiles,
deliberately
which
and
means they are
thoughtfully.
not subject
The
to the
key
UN
to
Security
sustainable
Council
growth
resolution
lies in
framework that governs
understanding the
Iran's
subtle
long-range
shifts in the
delivery
market.
systems.
We need to
They are
adapt
not
deliberately
chemical or
and
biological
thoughtfully.
weapons, which
The
means
key
the
to
Chemical
sustainable
Weapons
growth
Convention and the
lies in
Biological Weapons
understanding the
Convention
subtle
do
shifts
not
in the
apply.
market. We need
An
to
EMP
adapt
weapon program is in
deliberately
the
and
strictest
thoughtfully.
legal sense,
The key to
unrestricted
sustainable
by
growth
any
lies
international
in
treaty Iran
understanding
has
the
signed.
subtle shifts in the market.
And Iran has known this.
We need to
The
adapt
clerical
deliberately
establishment and
and
the IRGC's
thoughtfully.
Weapons
The
Acquisition
key to
Directorate
sustainable
have known
growth
this for at
lies
least
in
12
understanding
years.
the subtle shifts
The
in the
Isfahan
market.
facility is the
We
physical
need to
evidence of what
adapt
they chose to do with
deliberately
that
and
knowledge.
thoughtfully. The
What
key
an EMP
to
weapon
sustainable
does,
growth
in the
lies in
context of a potential
understanding the
conflict
subtle
with the United
shifts in the
States,
market.
is something that
We need to
American
adapt
military planners
deliberately
have studied
and
with quite
thoughtfully.
intensity
The
since the
key
late
to sustainable
1990s.
growth lies in
A sufficiently
understanding the
powerful
subtle shifts in the
electromagnetic
market.
pulse delivered
We
at the
need to
right
adapt
altitude over the right
deliberately and
geography
thoughtfully.
does
The
not
key
kill
to
people
sustainable
directly.
growth
It
lies
kills
in
the
understanding
electronics
the
that keep
subtle
modern
shifts in
infrastructure
the market.
functioning.
We need to adapt
Power
deliberately
grids,
and thoughtfully.
water
The key to
treatment
sustainable
systems,
growth lies in understanding
hospital
the
equipment,
subtle shifts in the market.
financial transaction
We need to
networks,
adapt
the GP's
deliberately
satellite
and thoughtfully.
receivers that guide
The
precision
key to
munitions,
sustainable
the
growth
communications
lies in
architecture that
understanding
allows
the
a
subtle
carrier strike
shifts in the
group to
market.
coordinate its air wing,
We need to adapt
and a conflict
deliberately
where the
and
United States is
thoughtfully.
attempting to project power from offshore platforms into Iranian airspace, an EMP capability targeting those platforms' electronics is not a peripheral concern. It is potentially
The key
the
to
single
sustainable
most
growth
asymmetric
lies in
capability Iran
understanding
could
the
develop,
subtle shifts in
and
the
the one for
market.
which the American
We
military
need to
has the
adapt
least straightforward
deliberately and
countermeasure.
thoughtfully.
The Isfahan
The key to
facility was
sustainable
identified as
growth
something more
lies
than a
in
warehouse
understanding the
by a
subtle
signals
shifts in the
intelligence
market.
collection that has not been
We need to
publicly
adapt
described in
deliberately
detail,
and
but whose
thoughtfully.
existence was
The key
confirmed
to sustainable
indirectly by a
growth
Senate Armed
lies in
Services Committee
understanding the
staff
subtle
report
shifts
published
in
in
the
redacted
market.
form last March.
We need to adapt deliberately
The
and
report noted,
thoughtfully.
in a
The key
passage
to
that was not
sustainable
redacted,
growth lies
that
in
classified
understanding the
collection
subtle
against
shifts in the
electromagnetic
market.
warfare
We
research
need to
activities
adapt
in the Islamic
deliberately
Republic of
and
Iran
thoughtfully.
has
The
produced
key to
assessments of
sustainable
capability
growth
advancement
lies
at
in
a pace that
understanding the
exceeds
subtle
previous
shifts
modeling.
in the market.
That
We need to
sentence,
adapt
in the
deliberately
language of a
and
Senate staff
thoughtfully.
report, is
The
not
key to
hedged.
sustainable growth
It is the equivalent
lies
of a
in
fire alarm
understanding
in
the subtle
bureaucratic
shifts
prose.
in the market. We need
The
to
physical
adapt
evidence followed
deliberately
the signals
and thoughtfully.
intelligence.
The key
Commercial
to
satellite
sustainable
imagery
growth
from Maxar
lies in
Technologies,
understanding the
analyzed by the
subtle
Open Source
shifts in the
Research
market.
Unit at Middlebury
We
Institute
need
of
to
International
adapt
Studies,
deliberately and
documented a
thoughtfully.
pattern of
The
vehicle
key to
movement at the
sustainable
Isfahan
growth
site
lies in
that is specifically
understanding the subtle
consistent with
shifts in the
high-value
market.
component delivery,
We
heavy
need to
transport
adapt
arriving at night,
deliberately
with
and
no
thoughtfully.
corresponding
The
departure,
key to
at
sustainable
intervals
growth
of
lies in
approximately 30
understanding the
days.
subtle shifts in
Components
the
going
market.
in, nothing nothing going
We
out
need to
for
adapt
18 months.
deliberately and
That is not
thoughtfully.
warehousing,
The
that
key
is
to
assembly.
sustainable growth
Read that
lies
again
in
and hold it.
understanding the subtle shifts in the
The
market.
confirmation that the
We
facility
need
had
to
been added
adapt
to the U.
deliberately and
S,
thoughtfully.
targeting
The
architecture
key to
came not from
sustainable
an official
growth
statement,
lies in
but from a
understanding the
procurement
subtle
record.
shifts in the market.
The
We need to
U.S.
adapt
Air Force
deliberately
published a
and
routine
thoughtfully.
contract modification notice on the Defense Technical Information Center's public procurement portal on July 14th, 16 days ago, awarding a modification to an existing
The key
contract
to
for
sustainable
high-altitude
growth lies in
electromagnetic hardening
understanding
of
the
precision
subtle
guidance
shifts in
systems
the
on
market.
GBU series munitions.
We need to adapt
That is an
deliberately
extremely
and
specific
thoughtfully.
procurement action.
The key to
You do
sustainable
not harden the
growth
guidance
lies in
systems on your bunker
understanding the
buster
subtle
bombs
shifts
against
in the market.
electromagnetic
We
interference
need to
unless you are
adapt
planning to use those
deliberately
bombs
and
in an
thoughtfully.
environment where an
The key
adversary
to
is
sustainable
capable of
growth
generating
lies
that
in
interference.
understanding the subtle shifts
The
in the
contract
market.
modification was
We
for an
need to adapt
accelerated delivery
deliberately
timeline.
and thoughtfully.
6
The key
weeks,
to sustainable
not 6
growth
months.
lies
Now
in
let's go inside the
understanding the
operational
subtle
picture
shifts
of
in the
why this
market.
target
We
changes
need
the
to
strategic
adapt
calculus in a way
deliberately
that
and
none of the
thoughtfully.
previously
The
discussed
key to
Iranian nuclear
sustainable
facilities
growth
do.
lies in
Every
understanding the
facility in
subtle
Iran's
shifts in the
nuclear
market.
infrastructure is, in the
We need
final
to
analysis,
adapt
a
deliberately
manufacturing
and
problem.
thoughtfully. The key to
If you destroy
sustainable
the enrichment
growth
facility,
lies in
you have set back
understanding
the
the
enrichment
subtle shifts
timeline.
in the
If you
market.
destroy the
We
delivery
need to
system
adapt
production line,
deliberately and
you have set
thoughtfully.
back the delivery
The key to
capability.
sustainable growth
These are
lies in
valuable military
understanding the
objectives,
subtle shifts in
but
the
they are
market.
objectives with a
We need to
reconstitution
adapt
pathway,
deliberately
given
and
time,
thoughtfully.
given
The key
resources,
to sustainable
given the
growth
survival of the
lies in
technical
understanding
personnel
the
and the
subtle shifts
institutional
in the
knowledge.
market.
A
We need to
nuclear
adapt
program can be
deliberately
rebuilt.
and thoughtfully.
An EMP
The
capability
key
is
to
different in
sustainable
kind,
growth
not just
lies in
degree.
understanding
It
the
is not a
subtle shifts
manufacturing
in the
problem.
market.
It is a
We need
strategy
to adapt
problem.
deliberately and
Because the
thoughtfully.
value of an EMP weapon is
The
not
key
the
to
device
sustainable
itself.
growth
It is the
lies in
threat the device
understanding the
creates.
subtle shifts
The
in the
moment your
market.
adversary knows you have
We
a
need to
credible EMP
adapt
capability,
deliberately
every
and
electronic
thoughtfully.
system they
The
operate
key to
inside your
sustainable
potential
growth
strike range is
lies in
operating under a
understanding
margin
the
of
subtle
vulnerability.
shifts in
The
the market.
deterrent value of the
We need
Isfahan
to
program
adapt
was not in
deliberately
its
and
warheads.
thoughtfully.
It was in the Pentagon's awareness of its existence. And now that awareness has crossed a threshold, the military track that follows the identification of the Isfahan
The
facility
key to sustainable
is,
growth
for the first
lies
time
in
in this
understanding
conflict's
the subtle
operational
shifts
arc,
in the market.
not primarily
We need
about
to
nuclear
adapt deliberately
non-proliferation.
and
It is
thoughtfully.
about force
The key
protection.
to sustainable
Strikes on the
growth
Isfahan
lies
facility
in
are not
understanding
designed to
the
prevent
subtle
Iran
shifts
from
in the
building a
market.
bomb.
We
They are
need to
designed to
adapt
protect American
deliberately and
aircraft,
thoughtfully.
ships, and
The key
precision
to
weapon
sustainable
systems
growth
from an
lies
adversary
in
capability
understanding the subtle
that,
shifts
if
in the
employed even
market.
partially, could
We
degrade
need
the
to
very
adapt
strike platforms
deliberately
being
and
used to hit
thoughtfully.
everything else.
The key to
The circular
sustainable
logic of
growth
that military
lies in
requirement.
understanding the
You
subtle
must hit the
shifts
EMP
in the
facility
market.
to safely hit the
We need
nuclear
to adapt
facilities, but
deliberately
hitting
and
anything
thoughtfully.
requires flying
The
through
key to
airspace where the
sustainable
EMP
growth
facility might
lies
already
in
be partially
understanding the subtle
operational,
shifts in the
is what has
market.
consumed the
We need to
deliberations
adapt
inside the Joint
deliberately
Chiefs for
and
the last
thoughtfully.
11 days.
The key
The
to
political and
sustainable
diplomatic
growth
track has
lies in
moved in a direction
understanding
that
the
will be
subtle
impossible
shifts
to
in the
reverse
market.
regardless of what
We need
happens
to
next.
adapt deliberately
The
and
identification
thoughtfully.
of the Isfahan
The key
EMP
to
program
sustainable
has been
growth
formally shared
lies in
with three
understanding
allies,
the subtle shifts
the
in the
United
market.
Kingdom, France, and
We
Israel,
need to adapt
and informally
deliberately and
communicated to Saudi
thoughtfully.
Arabia the
The
way,
key
and
to
Jordan through a
sustainable
classified
growth
briefing
lies in
channel.
understanding
Each
the
of those
subtle
governments now
shifts in
know
the
something
market.
that is not
We
publicly
need to
known.
adapt
That
deliberately and
Iran's weapons
thoughtfully.
development
The
program has
key
a
to
dimension
sustainable
that the
growth
entire
lies in
international diplomatic
understanding the
framework has
subtle
never
shifts
addressed,
in the market.
because it
We
falls
need to
outside
adapt
every treaty
deliberately
regime in
and
existence.
thoughtfully.
There is
The
no
key to
PAA
sustainable
inspection
growth
protocol for
lies
EMP
in
research.
understanding the
There is no
subtle
UN
shifts in the
Security
market.
Council resolution
We
covering
need to adapt
electromagnetic weapons
deliberately
development.
and thoughtfully.
The legal
The
architecture
key
that
to
governs
sustainable
every
growth
diplomatic
lies
engagement
in
with Iran's
understanding
weapons
the
program
subtle
does
shifts
not
in the
cover
market.
this,
We
which
need
means
to
any
adapt
future
deliberately
negotiating
and
framework will have
thoughtfully.
to be built from scratch to address it. And Iran knows it will, and has been buying time while that framework didn't exist. The psychological pressure track operating
The
inside
key
Iran
to
in the wake of
sustainable
the
growth
Isfahan
lies
revelation
in
is visible in a
understanding
very
the subtle
specific way.
shifts in the market.
The IRGC's
We
public
need to adapt
communications
deliberately
apparatus,
and
its official
thoughtfully.
social media
The
channels,
key to
its
sustainable
affiliated
growth
news
lies
networks,
in
its
understanding the
clerical
subtle
mouthpieces
shifts
and
in the
calm,
market.
has
We
gone
need to
completely
adapt
silent on the
deliberately
subject of
and
electromagnetic
thoughtfully.
warfare.
The key to sustainable
defensive,
growth lies in
not
understanding
denying,
the subtle
silent.
shifts in the
In the
market.
communications
We need to
apparatus that has a
adapt
documented
deliberately
reflex of
and
issuing
thoughtfully.
rapid, aggressive
The key
denials
to
of any
sustainable
Western
growth
intelligence claim
lies in
about Iranian
understanding
military
the subtle
capability.
shifts in the
Silence
market.
is a specific
We need
kind
to
of
adapt
statement.
deliberately and
It means the
thoughtfully.
regime has
The
calculated
key
that
to
any
sustainable
response,
growth
confirmation,
lies in
denial, or
understanding
deflection
the subtle shifts
creates
in the
more
market.
strategic risk than
We
saying
need to
nothing at all.
adapt deliberately
That is the
and
silence of an
thoughtfully.
organization that
The
knows
key
its
to
secret is
sustainable
out
growth
and has not
lies
yet
in
decided what to do
understanding the
about it.
subtle shifts in the
The
market.
honest assessment is this:
We need to
the
adapt
discovery of the
deliberately
Isfahan
and
EMP program
thoughtfully.
is not
The
the
key
end
to
of a story
sustainable
about
growth
Iranian weapons
lies in
development.
understanding the subtle
It
shifts
is the
in the
beginning of
market.
a story about a
We need to
category of
adapt
military capability
deliberately
that no
and
existing
thoughtfully.
international
The
framework is
key to
equipped to
sustainable
address.
growth lies
The
in
targets that will
understanding
follow
the
this
subtle shifts
revelation,
in the
if
market.
strikes proceed,
We need to
are not on
adapt
any list that
deliberately
has
and
previously been
thoughtfully.
discussed in
The
public.
key to
They
sustainable
are on a
growth
list that was
lies in
assembled in the last
understanding the
11
subtle
days
shifts in the market.
by people who
We
spent the
need to
previous
adapt
decade being
deliberately
told this
and
program was a
thoughtfully.
theoretical
The
concern.
key to
What is
sustainable
not
growth
clear is whether
lies
the
in
decision to add
understanding
those
the
targets
subtle
to the
shifts
strike
in the
package was
market.
made before
We need to
or after
adapt
the intelligence
deliberately and
confirmation reached the
thoughtfully.
Oval Office,
The key to
and whether the
sustainable
6-week
growth
accelerated
lies in
delivery
understanding the
timeline on that
subtle
Air Force
shifts in the
contract
market.
modification
We
means
need
the
to
weapons are
adapt
already in
deliberately
position.
and thoughtfully.
July 30th, 2026, for 3 years. A cluster of nondescript buildings on the eastern outskirts of Isfahan appeared on satellite
The
imagery
key
as a
to
warehouse
sustainable
complex.
growth lies in
Tonight,
understanding
the
the
people who
subtle
filed it
shifts
under
in the
logistics
market.
and moved on
We
are
need
not
to
sleeping
adapt
especially
deliberately
well.
and
And the
thoughtfully.
people who knew
The
exactly
key to
what it
sustainable
was are not
growth
sleeping at
lies
all.
in understanding the